Her name was Sarah. She was 28, working 2 shifts cleaning offices downtown, trying to keep a rusted-out Honda Civic from collapsing into spare parts. Night, the Civic lost the fight. It sputtered, coughed out a lungful of oily white smoke, and settled into a permanent ominous silence right beneath a sodium lamp that struggled valiantly to pierce the oppressive gloom. The silence was louder than the engine's frantic death rattle. It was the sound of complete exposure. Sarah gripped the cold plastic of the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She leaned her forehead against the glass, momentarily giving in to the sheer grinding exhaustion that had been her constant companion for the last 18 months. The rain blurred the world outside, turning the shadows into shapeless, menacing watercolors. She reached for her cell phone. 1 bar, no signal for a call. The despair was instantaneous, a lead weight dropping into her stomach. She was adrift, a fragile island in a rising tide of urban indifference. That's when the shadows began to coalesce. She didn't hear a car. She didn't hear footsteps at first, only the rhythmic drumming of the deluge masking everything else. But she felt the pressure shift, like the air itself had grown heavy, viscous, holding its breath. She lifted her head and scanned the side mirror. Nothing. Just the endless stretch of abandoned warehouses, their broken windows like vacant eyes staring into the void. Then, the movement, slow, deliberate. They materialized from the blackness surrounding the broken loading docks of the old Atlas manufacturing plant. 3 of them. They didn't hurry. Predators never do. They moved with the languid, assured pace of men who understood that time and territory were theirs. They wore dark hoodies, cinched tight, obscuring their faces entirely, rendering them faceless avatars of the city's malice. They were the hungry ghosts of every corner lot, the inevitable endpoint of economic collapse and moral decay. One approached the driver's side. He tapped the window once, a soft, sickening click that resonated through the thin metal of the car door like a gunshot. His gesture was casual, almost bored, an entitlement radiating from him that chilled Sarah deeper than the January air seeping through the cracked seals. "Hey now!" The man's voice was a low, gravelly rasp, barely audible over the rain. It held a false familiarity, the kind of tone used to butter up a victim right before the knife comes out. "Car trouble? Looks like you're stranded, sweetheart." Sarah shook her head, an involuntary, frantic motion. She pulled her hands into her lap, trying to make herself smaller, irrelevant. "No? No thank you, I called someone, they're on the way." The lie felt pathetic, brittle. The second man walked around the back, positioning himself near the passenger door, blocking any escape. He was taller, broader, a silent mountain of menace. He didn't speak, but his posture, shoulders slightly hunched, hands deep in pockets, spoke volumes. He was waiting for the permission to break things. The third man took up a position 15 feet back, standing sentinel in the middle of the empty street. He was the scout, the lookout, the final barrier. He stood absolutely motionless, his silhouette cut against the weak yellow light, a still point in the storm. The driver's side man chuckled, a sound devoid of humor, purely corrosive. "Now, why would you lie to us, Sarah?" He knew her name. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. They weren't opportunistic junkies stumbling upon a mark. They had been watching, waiting. This was orchestrated. Her small island of safety had just been breached, and the tide was rising fast around her throat. She fumbled for the locks, but they were already engaged. She looked desperately down at the gear shift, calculating the impossible chance of muscling the car into neutral and attempting to push it. But her muscles felt like water. She felt the heavy, paralyzing onset of shock. The man tapped the glass again, this time with slightly more impatience, a reminder that their false politeness was rapidly expiring. "Open the door. We just want to help you." "Please," she whispered, the sound a ragged, desperate plea torn from her very soul. It was a prayer addressed to the empty air, to the cold god of the city. "Please. Someone—" She was trapped, enclosed in a sheet metal cage, the glass offering the illusion of protection while amplifying her vulnerability. The 3 shapes outside swelled, seeming to absorb the light and magnify the darkness. The moment stretched, elastic and agonizing, the prelude to inevitable violence humming in the air between them. Her breath hitched, catching in her throat, a tiny gasp of pure terror. But then something changed. It wasn't a sound, not yet. It was a cancellation of sound. The steady drum of the rain suddenly seemed distant, muffled. The deep rumble of the city's life, the distant sirens, the whine of the elevated train 4 blocks over, vanished. The immediate area around the car seemed to fall into an unnatural, profound vacuum. The sentinel, the third man, standing in the street, shifted. It was a minute movement, barely perceptible but distinct. His head tilted slightly, not toward the car, but toward the overwhelming, unpenetrated darkness behind the abandoned factories. His aggressive posture softened just an inch, replaced by a subtle reflexive tension. He had sensed something. The man beside Sarah's window, still chuckling softly in anticipation of her surrender, paused mid-breath. His focus fractured, pulled away from the immediate gratification of the trapped woman toward the inexplicable chill that had just gripped the district. Sarah noticed their distraction. Her eyes, wide and reflecting the sickly yellow lamplight, darted from the man at the driver's door to the silent shape in the middle of the street. They were uneasy. The hunters had momentarily stopped hunting. The feeling intensified, an invasive, clinical coldness cutting through the humid night air. It wasn't the weather. It was presence. A presence that didn't belong to the casual, chaotic violence of this part of town. This presence was surgical, disciplined, and utterly uncompromising. It carried the heavy scent of ozone and the undeniable ferrous odor of consequence. It was the sudden realization that the darkness was not empty. From the deepest well of shadow, where the light died completely, there emerged not a sound of approach, but an implication of arrival. It was too fast to be seen, too quiet to be heard, yet it vibrated in the soles of their boots and in the back of their necks. The sentinel finally broke his stance. He turned fully, pulling his hands from his pockets, the movement jerky and driven by instinctual fear. He wasn't looking for police sirens or rival gang members. He was looking for a ghost. A shadow detached itself from the wall of an old storage building, a shadow that seemed deeper, more absolute than the natural night. It moved with the impossible fluidity of a predator whose only purpose is efficiency. It did not stalk. It flowed. The man blocking the passenger door finally spoke, his voice no longer confident but strained. "What the hell is that?" The man by Sarah's window peered into the night. His hand, which moments before had been poised to smash the glass, now dropped slightly, hovering over his waist. He was still assessing the threat, unable to categorize it. It wasn't the sloppy, drug-fueled paranoia common in the industrial graveyard. This was different. This was precise. This was lethal intent wrapped in silence. The figure in the shadows hadn't made a single aggressive movement, yet the atmosphere had curdled, switching from tense anticipation to outright terror. The feeling was primal, instantaneous, the sudden understanding that they were no longer the threat. They were the target. Sarah, watching their panic through the wet glass, felt a cold, paradoxical shiver run down her spine. It was a different kind of terror, a fear edged with awe. She had whispered a desperate plea into the void, and the void had answered, not with a helping hand but with a silent, iron certainty. The sentinel raised his arm, brandishing something dark and metallic, a cheap semi-automatic pistol, and aimed it blindly into the darkness. "Show yourself, I see you!" The response was not verbal. It was a subtle shift in the composition of the shadows. The figure hadn't moved forward, but somehow it had become clearer, taller, broader, and on its chest, briefly illuminated by a sliver of yellow light reflecting off the chrome bumper of the Civic, a stark white shape seemed to momentarily materialize and dissolve, a grinning symbol of absolute finality. The three men were surrounded not by walls, but by an encroaching tactical despair. The rain continued its steady, relentless drumming, providing perfect cover for the reckoning that had just arrived. The Vigilante was there, a silent, implacable judge standing in the shadows of the forgotten quarter, already weighing the cost of the sins committed beneath the dying streetlights. And the cost, Sarah understood immediately, was absolute. The standoff had begun. The city had found its witness. The sentinel, driven by the hot, primal panic that overrides training and caution, squeezed the trigger before his mind fully processed the target. The cheap pistol spat fire, a weak, flickering orange flash that was immediately swallowed by the sheeting rain and the cavernous, open space of the abandoned loading zone. Crack, crack, crack. 3 shots, clumsy and desperate, aimed not at the shadowy figure, but at the idea of the figure. The bullets found only the damp, rusted corrugated iron of the factory wall 15 feet behind where the figure stood, sounding like pebbles dropped onto sheet metal. The vigilante, framed momentarily by the muzzle flash, did not flinch, did not duck, did not accelerate his pace. He simply adjusted his stance, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift of weight that suggested the bullets had been expected, calculated, and already discounted. The silence that followed the futile violence was heavier than the gunfire had been. It was the silence of professional judgment. Sarah, pressed back against the worn leather of the Civic's seat, watched the scene unfold through the streaks of rain on the glass. The air inside the car felt suddenly sterile, the fear that had been her constant companion replaced by a profound, paralyzing awe. She was watching not a confrontation, but an execution delayed. The man outside her car, the one whose breathing had ragged when he pulled the trigger, was already dead. He just hadn't fallen over yet. The vigilante moved, not toward them but diagonally, dissolving his silhouette against the background of stacked pallets and oil drums. He wasn't retreating. He was achieving tactical superiority. He was melting into the geometry of the night, becoming a moving blind spot. The man guarding the passenger side, the one who had been chuckling, shouted, his voice high and ragged, "He's behind us! Shoot him! Shoot him! Where the hell is he?" The third man, huddled near the Civic's grill, hissed, his own cheap weapon trembling in his hand. The vigilante offered no visual confirmation, no sound of movement. He offered only consequence. A new sound split the drumming rain, not gunfire, but a sharp, precise metallic thwang, followed instantly by the high-pitched shriek of vaporized tungsten. The nearest street lamp, the sickly yellow fixture that had provided the only weak illumination for the last 100 yards, exploded inward in a shower of fractured glass and dying electricity. The remaining light in the forgotten quarter vanished completely. The darkness that descended was absolute, wet and suffocating. It was a darkness not merely defined by the absence of light, but weighted by intent. The 3 men reacted like panicked animals in a collapsed burrow. Their formation broke instantly. The discipline of the hunt dissolved into the immediate, desperate instinct for self-preservation. "Scatter! Scatter!" the sentinel roared, spinning blindly, firing one more wild round that chewed harmlessly into the asphalt. The vigilante, now moving with impossible swiftness through the manufactured blackness, utilized the milliseconds of chaos. A dark, impossibly dense weight slammed into the sentinel's jaw. There was a dull, sickening thud, not a wet crack, but the sound of heavy, reinforced composite meeting bone. The sentinel pitched backward, landing heavily in a puddle, his pistol skittering away and disappearing into the oily runoff near the curb. He wasn't dead, but he was certainly no longer a factor. The 2 remaining men, paralyzed by the sudden, silent violence, tried to bolt in opposite directions. The man who had guarded the Civic's grill scrambled toward the mouth of a narrow, debris-choked alley. The one known as Leo, the former chuckler, stumbled toward the driver's side door, his mind fixated on escape, perhaps fueled by a desperate, misplaced urge to take the woman as a shield or a distraction. In the moment, Leo grabbed the recessed handle of Sarah's door, trying to yank it open. A pressurized burst of air, tight and focused, slammed into the door panel inches from his hand. It wasn't a bullet. It was a warning, a non-lethal statement of capability. The noise was like a sledgehammer hitting a piano wire. Leo screamed, not from injury, but from the sudden, overwhelming proximity of death. He let go, stumbled over his own feet, and vanished into the shadows between 2 colossal, rusting storage tanks. The silence returned, marked only by the relentless, monotonous drumming of the rain against the Civic's roof and the steady drip of water from the remaining overhead conduits. The air, though still thick with industrial exhaust and damp concrete, now also tasted faintly of gunpowder and ozone. Inside the car, Sarah realized she was shaking uncontrollably, but the tears had stopped. Her door remained closed, but as Leo had wrenched the handle in his panic, she felt the latch mechanism give way with a soft, final click. The door was no longer secured. The lock was broken. She was safe only by the vigilante's current focus, not by her physical constraints. The figure emerged from the veil of shadow not 5 yards from the car, stepping over the prone, groaning body of the sentinel. He was massive, armored in black composite and webbing, designed to absorb and distribute kinetic energy, built to defy the chaotic physics of urban warfare. The white skull insignia on his chest was muted, almost charcoal grey in the oppressive darkness, visible only because it seemed to devour the little ambient light that managed to scatter. He didn't look at Sarah. He didn't look at the fleeing men. He looked at the street, reading the narrative of the fight in the wet concrete. He was a mechanism of consequence, and mechanisms do not operate on emotion, only on input and output. The city is a diseased body, he thought, the rain washing down his cowl and running into the deep grooves of his Kevlar vest. And the forgotten quarter is where the infection festers, spreading spores into the bloodstream of the infrastructure. He ran a gloved hand along the hood of the Civic, checking the direction of the slugs that had nearly hit the engine block. Inefficient, wasteful, sloppy. These were small-time predators, low-grade infection, but they were feeding on the vulnerable, and that made them a priority. His attention shifted to Sarah. He paused near the driver's door, his silhouette immense and terrifying, yet somehow reassuring because of the focused brutality he represented. He didn't open the door, didn't speak a word. He merely established her status as a non-combatant. Sarah lifted a trembling hand and pressed it against the glass. Even through the barrier, she felt the heavy gravity of his presence. He was the answer to a prayer she hadn't dared to articulate, but an answer wrapped in the steel of vengeance, not salvation. The vigilante grunted, a low, mechanical sound that might have been acknowledgement or merely the sound of his armored bulk shifting. And then he turned away from the car, his focus returning entirely to the pursuit. He was not interested in immediate, easy kills. He was interested in cleaning the pipeline. These three men, scattered and terrified, were simply threads leading into the larger tapestry of the rot they served. He tracked the first fugitive, the man who fled into the narrow alley. The tracks were easy, clumsy boots scraping gravel, the scent of stale cigarette smoke clinging to the moist air, and a small, fresh splash mark where the man had misjudged a puddle. The alley swallowed the weak light from the distant main thoroughfare, becoming a suffocating trench of brick and dripping condensation. The walls were stained with history, faded, angry graffiti, the black residue of old fires, and the perpetual slickness of industrial runoff. Every surface was coated in a fine layer of soot and decay, the city breathing its filth back onto itself. The vigilante entered the alley. His tactical awareness mapped the space instantly. 40 feet of restricted movement, dead end ahead marked by an insurmountable chain-link fence topped with razor wire, and a fire escape halfway down. He moved low, his reinforced boots making less sound on the wet concrete than the gentle shh of his rain-slicked jacket. He was a silent black counterforce to the environment's inherent noise. Justice here is a misnomer, he reflected, the thought a cold, hard line in the chaos of the night. Justice implies a system that failed. I am the remediation of that failure. I am the calculation of debt. He knew their motivation. Intimidation, theft, maybe worse. The Forgotten Quarter was territory managed by sloppy local crews, the Sentinels and their ilk, who relied on localized terror and the absolute certainty that the police cruiser would never make it this far off the main road. The police were a distant myth here, a phone number that rang busy, a promise broken by systematic apathy and corruption that seeped down from the top like sewage. He didn't hate the men he hunted. Hatred required emotional investment. He viewed them as anomalies that needed zeroing out. They were statistics proving the city's infection rate. He reached the fire escape. The scent of the man was strong here, mixed with the sharp odor of fear-induced sweat. The fugitive had climbed perhaps 10 feet and was now clinging beneath the landing of the first floor, desperately trying to merge with the rust-colored shadows beneath the platform. The vigilante stopped at the base of the fire escape. He looked up, not needing to adjust his gaze. The man above him was panting, his shallow breaths rattling in the metallic structure. "You can stay there and get wet," the vigilante said, his voice deep, completely devoid of inflection, like gravel grating on stone. It was the first time Sarah, watching from the relative safety of the civic mirror, had heard him speak. It was not a man's voice, it was the sound of a verdict. The man above didn't answer immediately. He was processing the sound, the realization that he had been seen instantly. "I didn't do nothing," the fugitive whined, the sound pathetic and thin against the rain. "It was Sentinel. He set it up. Every link in the chain is responsible for the weight of the load." the vigilante stated, his eyes, invisible behind the darkened lenses of his mask, fixed on the man's trembling boots. You were party to the intimidation. You participated in the fear. He reached up, his movements economical. He didn't climb. He simply grasped the lowest rung of the metal ladder. The fugitive knew what was coming, the inevitability of the reckoning. He scrambled higher, his fear providing a burst of adrenaline. He reached the second landing, trying to swing around the corner of the building to find the roof. The vigilante didn't follow the fugitive's path. He didn't need to. He pulled a small compressed canister from his belt, a tactical flash smoke device designed to disorient without permanent harm. The system he served demanded precision, not wanton destruction. He needed to disable, extract information, and then neutralize. He threw the canister. It arced perfectly, bouncing off the fire escape platform and landing precisely where the fugitive was trying to make his pivot onto the roof access. The canister hissed open. It didn't explode in fire, but in a blinding, clinical white light, coupled with a thick, acrid cloud of smoke that immediately soaked up the ambient moisture. The fugitive shrieked as the light overwhelmed his vision, turning the absolute darkness into an intolerable, blazing white hell. He stumbled backward, losing his grip on the slippery railing. He fell. Not far, maybe 12 feet, hitting the damp alley floor with a heavy, concussive thump that knocked the breath from his lungs and the fight from his spirit. The vigilante stepped over the writhing figure, quickly deploying a zip tie to secure his hands before the panic subsided. He knelt, leaning close. "Who are you working for?" The voice was a surgical instrument. "Who owns this territory now?" The man gasped, trying to suck air past his bruised ribs. I don't know. Just local, man. Just the usual." "The usual has a name," the vigilante corrected, the silence of his pause more threatening than any shout. "And the usual has a ledger. You are going to tell me who collects the percentage on the stolen copper and the protection money from the docks." He stood, dragging the secured man back toward the mouth of the alley. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the hunt was not over. 2 more were still loose, and the remaining thug, Leo, had confirmed Sarah's vulnerability by breaking the lock. He passed the alley entrance and looked toward the Civic. Sarah was still watching, her face pale, a silent witness to his brutal methodology. He dragged the captive man past her car, forcing the thug to acknowledge his victim one last time. The vigilante then moved swiftly toward the deep, cavernous space between the abandoned factories where Leo had fled. This area was far more dangerous, a maze of obsolete machinery, towering stacks of forgotten materials, and deep, pitch-black pools of stagnant chemical waste. It was the heart of the quarter, where shadows lived permanently. He scanned the entrance to the industrial complex, adjusting the sensitivity of his own optics. The rain had briefly slowed to a heavy drizzle, leaving the air thick and smelling of iron and petroleum. "The hunt continues into the darkness," he concluded, allowing his massive frame to melt into the opening of the factory floor. He was leaving the sentinel and the bound man behind for now, secure in the knowledge that they were neutralized and the vehicle was temporarily safe. He stepped across the threshold, entering the absolute, consuming blackness of the manufacturing graveyard, guided only by the fading echo of a man's terrified scramble and the cold, unyielding arithmetic of his mission. The vigilante was deep in the rotten guts of the city now, and the search for the remaining loose ends and the identity of the boss they served was paramount. The silence inside the vast factory was broken only by the drip, drip, drip of industrial condensation, marking the measured steps of the implacable judge. The night had only just begun its reckoning. The silence inside the vast, decaying factory complex was not empty. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of entropy. It swallowed sound, absorbed the dim light from the street lamps struggling through the cracked industrial windows high above, and magnified the subtle biological noises of a predator moving through its natural habitat. The vigilante took his first steps onto the floor, his combat boots meeting a thick layer of industrial grime and particulate matter that muffled the sound to almost nothing. He moved like a shadow separating itself from the larger darkness, a precise, massive figure in an environment built for giants, now haunted by ghosts. The air here was a complex cocktail of decay, the metallic tang of rust mixed with the cloying sweetness of evaporating chemical runoff, punctuated by the deep, earthy smell of wet concrete. He adjusted his thermal overlay, filtering out the ambient heat signature of the machinery and focusing only on the biological trails. Leo was panicked, predictable. Panic generated heat, and heat generated noise. Leo was running blind through a maze designed to trap the unwary. This place, the industrial graveyard of the quarter, was the perfect analogy for the city itself. Decades ago, it was the engine of progress, churning out steel and prosperity. Now it was a cancer site, abandoned by industry but colonized by the rot. It harbored the lowest denominators of the urban ailment, the smugglers, the users, the petty thugs who thought they were kings because they commanded 12 feet of shadowed territory. But the Vigilante knew better. These were just the symptoms. The real sickness resided uptown, in the high-rise offices, where the ledgers were balanced and the percentages of fear were calculated. He tracked Leo past a colossal skeletal stamping press, its enormous arm frozen mid-descent, looking like a prehistoric predator killed mid-strike. He saw a scrape mark, fresh concrete dust disturbed by a heel scuffing hard against the ground. Leo was moving too fast, too clumsily. Desperation was a tactical disadvantage. The Vigilante slowed his pace further, allowing his perception to extend into the consuming blackness. He didn't rely solely on technology. He relied on the grim arithmetic of cause and effect. A man running this terrified doesn't think about obstacles. He thinks only about escape. He would follow the paths of least resistance, which in this factory meant weaving around the massive support pillars and sticking close to the walls, trying to make himself small. The hunt is only the preliminary function, he reflected, his internal monologue cold and detached. The interrogation is the primary tool. Extraction of information is the priority. The city demands accountability, but accountability is impossible without accurate figures. He swept his gaze across the floor towards an area where giant conveyor belts, now frayed and dangling like rotting ribbons, disappeared into a lower sublevel. He caught a flash of movement, a disruption in the natural pattern of the shadows. Leo. He was attempting to hide behind a stack of enormous corroded engine blocks, trying to regulate his ragged, heavy breathing. The Vigilante could almost hear the frantic drum of the man's heart over the distant, steady drip of condensate. He didn't move directly toward him. That was predictable. He utilized the environment, circling wide, putting 3 colossal, dormant generators between himself and the target. He needed to assess the situation, ensure Leo wasn't carrying a weapon he was willing to discharge blindly in panic, and more importantly, ensure that the other fugitive wasn't lurking in the deep background, waiting for an opportunity. As he moved, his foot knocked lightly against a loose piece of lumber. He froze instantly, waiting for the echo to dissipate, waiting for Leo's reaction. Leo remained motionless, hoping the noise was just the factory settling. The Vigilante took advantage of the pause to examine the immediate surroundings, pulling back from the pursuit for a moment to analyze the context. He was deep inside the core structure now, far past the entry points the casual squatter would use, and something was wrong. While the majority of the machinery was rusted and clearly obsolete, there were specific areas that showed signs of very recent, very organized activity. Near the generator banks, for example, the layer of decades-old grime had been scrupulously cleaned, exposing the original polished concrete floor beneath. Not only that, but a heavy-gauge, commercial-grade electrical cable, too thick for squatters or typical copper thieves, snaked from a power junction box toward a distant, walled-off section of the factory, known historically as the processing annex. He knelt, running a gloved hand across the floor near the cable. No dust. The cable had been laid recently. This wasn't a scavenger operation. This was a logistical hub. The usual has evolved, he noted grimly. The small-time protection racket he had anticipated was just the camouflage for something far more significant. The stolen copper was the bait. The true operation was hidden behind the fear. He began tracing the line of the power cable, adjusting his vector away from the trapped Leo, who was still trembling 15 yards away, convinced he was invisible. The realization hit him with the cold finality of striking steel. This place was actively managed. It was a forward operating base for the Syndicate, not merely a storage area. The cable led him toward the annex, a segmented structure built within the main factory to house high-precision tooling. It was the only part of the complex with reinforced, non-shattered windows and a visible, steel-clad door. He approached the door. It was secured, not with a padlock that any street thug could break, but with an electronic combination lock, still displaying a faint, green operational LED light. This spoke of resources, professionalism, and organization that extended far beyond Leo and his clumsy counterparts. The people who owned this place were running a network, not a neighborhood. He reached into his utility belt, extracting a small proprietary tool, a delicate magnetic resonator designed to read the residual electromagnetic signature of a recent digital entry. He didn't want to break the door. He wanted to know who opened it last and when. As the device whirred softly, reading the faint electronic echo, the vigilante was forced to reconsider his entire tactical disposition. He had 2 men loose, one terrified and one still unaccounted for, and now a confirmed location of a centralized syndicate operation. If he engaged Leo now, the noise might alert whoever was operating inside the annex. If he focused on the annex, Leo might escape, taking crucial initial intelligence with him. Arithmetic demands efficiency, he concluded. Neutralize the known threat, then investigate the new variable. Leo was the loose thread he needed to pull to unravel the entire fabric. He put the resonator away and turned his attention back toward the engine blocks. He moved slowly now, the only sound the measured friction of his heavy coat against the dry, still air. He transitioned from tracking to tactical encirclement. Leo, still pressed against the cold steel, was fighting a losing battle against his own biology. His fear was now compounded by physical agony, the inevitable cramps of holding a rigid, unnatural position for too long. The vigilante saw the minute shuddering in the man's legs via the thermal scope. He was reaching the breaking point of human endurance. 5 steps. That was the distance. He moved the first 3 steps quickly, blending into the shadow cast by the towering generator. Leo's head snapped up, finally registering the impossibly swift intrusion into his sanctuary. "Don't move." The vigilante's voice cut through the silence, deep and absolute, a sound manufactured not by vocal cords, but by the gravity of consequence. Leo didn't move. He tried to whimper, but the sound was choked off by the paralyzing terror in his throat. His eyes wide and reflecting the faint green indicator light from the distant annex door, fixed on the approaching silhouette. "You ran from the reckoning," the vigilante continued, taking the 4th step. "You chose the long darkness." Leo tried to push himself backward, seeking refuge in the cold, unyielding wall of engine blocks. His hands scraped against the oily metal. "I didn't do nothing. I just watched. Leo, I just—" "You broke the lock on the woman's car," the vigilante interrupted, his voice devoid of emotion, a simple recitation of fact. "You participated in the imposition of fear. The price of participation is absolute." He took the final step, his massive form filling the space, eliminating any possibility of escape. He reached out with one hand, grabbing the front of Leo's coat with brutal precision, lifting him clear off the ground. Leo weighed maybe 160 pounds. He was handled like a sack of damp laundry. "The annex," the vigilante commanded, leaning in close so that Leo smelled the faint, clean scent of ozone and tactical gear, replacing the factory stink. "Who is inside? Who works the ledger?" Leo was dangling, his feet kicking uselessly a foot above the greasy floor. The pain from the restrictive grip was secondary to the sheer, overwhelming terror of meeting the inevitable judge. "Please, man, I swear I don't know. It's the Russians. They just started using the space. We just collect the payments on the outside, the small stuff. Protection, copper. They moved in 3 weeks ago. They pay us to keep the junkies away." The vigilante lowered him just enough so his toes touched the ground, adding a searing pressure to the man's chest cavity. The reference to Russians was a significant data point. Organized crime, international reach, utilizing local infrastructure. This was no longer just a vigilante raid. It was an interruption of a serious operational flow. 3 weeks, the vigilante stated, internalizing the timeline. "And who is the collection point? Who takes the percentage?" "Vanya. He runs the paperwork. He's the one. He drives the big dark truck. He—" Leo choked, trying desperately to convey the information before the grip tightened further. "He was supposed to be here tonight. They were moving the shipment. The puzzle pieces clicked into place. The sophisticated wiring, the cleaned floor, the secured door. This was not just an office. It was a transfer point. Suddenly, a dull, concussive thump echoed from the far end of the factory complex, near the entry where Sarah and the secured thug remained. It was followed by a sharp metallic sound, the unmistakable screech of metal on asphalt, the sound of a vehicle door being forcibly opened. The vigilante's focus snapped away from Leo. The other fugitive, the unaccounted third man who must have circled wide, found the secured thug and was now attempting to neutralize the evidence and possibly target Sarah. He dropped Leo instantly. The thug landed in a heap, gasping for air, forgotten for the moment. The priorities had shifted. Sarah. She was the witness, and she was vulnerable. The factory operation, Vanya, the ledger, all secondary to the immediate protection mandate. He sprinted back the way he had come, his massive form now moving with explosive speed, a kinetic blur through the oppressive darkness. The calculated, measured pace of the hunt was replaced by the urgent drive of defense. He reached the threshold of the factory complex's mouth, transitioning from the absolute darkness of the interior to the drizzling, grey-lit chaos of the alleyway. What he saw stopped him dead. The Civic was still there. The secured thug was gone. The zip tie was severed, lying on the damp pavement next to a smear of fresh oil and some disturbed gravel, and standing around Sarah's car, silhouetted against the weak street lamps, were three figures. Three large, well-built men. Not the remaining fugitive, who was likely small-time but heavy hitters. Vanya's crew. The shipment detail arriving early, finding their colleague incapacitated and their operation exposed. Sarah was still inside the Civic, the driver's side door locked, her hands hovering near the horn, terrified into paralysis. The three men had her boxed in, one leaning against the hood, one tapping impatiently on the driver's window with a large, meaty hand, and the third standing guard near the alley entrance, blocking the route to the main street. The man tapping the window spoke, his voice gravelly and thick with an Eastern European accent, echoing slightly in the alley. "Open the door, little bird. We just want to know where your friend went." The man in the black coat. Sarah did not respond. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white against the black plastic. Her face, visible now in the reflection of the Civic's dashlights, was pale, strained, a mirror of absolute dread. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too loud. The man on the hood chuckled, a nasty, short sound. "She is scared. It is good. Fear encourages cooperation." The third man, positioned near the alley entrance, suddenly shifted his weight. He had been looking away, scanning the street, but his eyes were now fixed on the profound darkness where the vigilante stood. He hadn't seen him yet, but he felt the shift in pressure, the impossible weight of a silent observer. The man near the Civic window pressed his face closer to the glass. Sarah whispered, the sound barely audible, ragged and desperate, the sound that had echoed across countless dark urban theaters before the final curtain call. "Please, someone." That was the line, the invocation. The moment the city, having ignored all pleas for conventional help, demanded the only solution left, the reckoning. The vigilante stepped fully out of the shadows. He didn't rush. He didn't charge. He simply moved, with the inexorable, unhurried certainty of a natural law being enforced. His presence was not an arrival. It was a geological event. The three men turned as one, their conversation dying on their lips. They saw the height, the bulk, the tactical silhouette that consumed light and displaced air. They saw the reflection of the street lamp glint off the stark white emblem on his chest, the stylized representation of absolute, cold justice. The man tapping the window instinctively recoiled, his hand dropping to the bulky sidearm holstered beneath his cheap black coat. He knew immediately that this was not a local cop, not a rival gang member, but the thing Leo had been babbling about, the ghost, the judge, the creature of the dark ledger. "He's the one," the man on the hood growled, reaching inside his jacket. "The bastard who took Dmitri." The vigilante spoke only one word, his voice cutting through the heavy drizzle like razor wire, aimed not at the men, but at the woman in the car. "Stay." Then his focus locked onto the trio. They were large, organized and armed, clearly experienced in inflicting violence. They were the muscle that protected Vanya's ledger. They were the true guardians of the cancer the Vigilante was here to excise. The Vigilante prepared himself. The slow, surgical extraction was over. This was the confrontation, the opening move in the dismantling of the Syndicate. The street-level skirmish had just escalated into war against the infrastructure of corruption. He needed to secure Sarah and eliminate these three without alerting anyone inside the heavily secured annex. The night was demanding a heavy toll, and the accountant of justice was ready to collect. The silence that followed the Vigilante's single, low command was the kind of silence usually reserved for a deep dive, when the immense pressure of the ocean rendered sound impossible. The heavy, cold drizzle that coated the grimy pavement seemed to be the only thing moving, turning the alleyway into a slick mirror reflecting the bruised orange glow of the city's indifferent light pollution. The three men were frozen, their collective focus skewered by the impossible figure standing just outside the perimeter of the Civic's safety zone. They saw the bulk, certainly, the impossible tactical configuration, but mostly they saw the symbol. That stark white skull, the geometry of judgment, stitched onto the black plate carrier. It was not a warning. It was a promise kept in blood. The man who had been tapping the window, Sergei, swallowed hard. His expensive knockoff leather jacket was already dark with rain clinging to the muscles beneath. He had spent years ensuring that no one ever looked at him with that specific, dead assessment. He gripped the handle of his weapon, but he didn't draw it. Drawing it meant committing, and committing against this thing felt less like a fight and more like an administration error leading to termination. The man on the hood, the one who had confirmed the identity, he's the one, took a stuttering step back, easing his weight off the car. He glanced nervously at Sarah inside the Civic, a calculation already forming in his eyes. Hostage or distraction? The Vigilante did not afford them the luxury of fear for long. He was already processing the spatial geometry of the threat. 3 targets. 1 soft target secured, Sarah. The environment was narrow, slick. The primary objective was securing the perimeter and ensuring the confrontation did not breach the silence required for the ultimate extraction within the annex. These 3 were merely static noise, requiring immediate silencing. He measured the distance to Sergei. 5 steps. The guard at the alley mouth 7 steps, complicated by a stack of wet, empty pallets. The man on the hood 4 steps, direct line of sight. They were large, clearly trained in Eastern Bloc military doctrine, heavy on brute force, light on finesse, predictable when panicked. They smelled of stale cigarettes, cheap cologne, and the bitter metal of recently handled firearms, the stench of the city's rot. For the Vigilante, the alley narrowed further, becoming a tunnel of focused intent. He didn't see 3 men. He saw 3 points of resistance in the infrastructure of Vanya's operation. Vanya's organization was a disease, a systemic infection spread through layers of complacency and cash, and these men were the visible, throbbing symptoms. Vanya's ledger, he thought, the concept running like cold brine through his mind. The ledger of the damned. Every face he dealt with, every thug he incapacitated, every corrupted bureaucrat he exposed, they were all entries in a long, unending column of moral debt. Tonight's collection was overdue. He felt the weight of Sarah's terrified whisper still hanging in the humid air. Please, someone. That was the sound that justified the skull, the sound of the innocent reaching the absolute nadir of their faith in civilized protection. When the police failed, when the politicians were bought, when the media looked away, the city cried out in that small, desperate, unheard frequency. He was the one who answered the call that nobody else could hear. He wasn't salvation. He was simply the inevitable consequence of unchecked wickedness. Sergei, trying desperately to break the paralyzing silence, spat a gob of phlegm onto the wet concrete. You made a mistake, Coatman. Dmitri was a small debt. Vanya pays in flesh. And we are the collectors. His hand twitched toward his sidearm, a nervous, habitual gesture. The Vigilante shifted his weight imperceptibly. A small movement balanced on the balls of his feet, settling his center of gravity. He did not speak again. Dialogue was a luxury reserved for those who had a future. These men had only an exit. The third man, the guard by the pallets, who looked younger, less hardened, maybe just desperate for the paycheck, found a sliver of courage in the suffocating tension. He raised a hand, trying to signal the others. The window, get the bird out now. We need leverage. It was a tactical decision born of desperation, a mistake rooted in the standard doctrine of thuggery, control the witness. But the vigilante had already factored the witness. Sarah was a secure liability, provided she remained exactly where she was. He moved on the guard by the pallets first. Not a charge, but an immediate acceleration from stillness to full operational speed. A blurring transition that defied the bulk of his frame. He used the narrow space not for running, but for generating leverage. Sergei and the hoodman reacted simultaneously, startled by the sudden violence of the movement. But they were a fraction of a second too slow, their minds still processing the ghost-like presence, while their muscles waited for a conventional threat. The pallet guard barely had time to widen his eyes. The vigilante closed the distance, not with a fist, but with the massive reinforced plate of his shoulder impacting the man's sternum. It wasn't a strike meant to wound. It was an energy transfer meant to immediately incapacitate and remove the threat from the operational zone. The sound was a sickening, muted thump, instantly drowned out by the guard's choked, surprised gasp as he was slammed backward against the wet brick wall. He crumpled, unconscious before he hit the ground, his cheap handgun skittering across the pavement and spinning into the shadows beneath the dumpster. A non-issue already solved. The skirmish had begun, but the tempo was wrong for the remaining two. It was too fast, too controlled, too professional. The man on the hood, abandoning all thought of strategy, ripped a heavy combat knife from his belt. The reflection of the street lamp flashed viciously off the wet steel. Sergei finally pulled his gun, a heavy 9mm, leveling it with shaking hands. "Stop right there," Sergei barked, his voice losing its gravelly threat and gaining a high-pitched edge of pure panic. The vigilante ignored the weapon, his focus fixed entirely on the knife wielder. A gun was a distance problem. A knife was an immediate close-quarter hazard. He had already angled his body, presenting the hardened ceramic plate of his vest as the primary target. He was a creature designed for absorbing kinetic energy. The knife wielder lunged, driven by the primitive urge to bleed the threat. He aimed a wide, desperate slash at the torso. The vigilante leaned into the strike, letting the blade skim uselessly off the tough fabric of the armor, absorbing the momentum. He used the brief contact point to lock his sight on the man's closest arm, wrapping his hand around the wrist. The grip was immediate and absolute, like steel clamps closing. A sharp, awful cracking sound, quickly muffled by the drizzle and the noise of their heavy breathing, indicated the dislocation of the wrist joint. The knife clattered harmlessly onto the hood of the Civic, mere inches from Sarah's terrified face inside. The knife wielder screamed, a raw sound of shocked agony, but the vigilante had already shifted his balance, leveraging the man's momentum against him. He spun the thug around and drove his knee into the small of the man's back, a focused strike to the nerve bundle that controlled motor function. The man went rigid, gasping, then collapsed into a wet, fetal heap, spasming weakly but entirely neutralized. 2 down in 3 seconds with near-surgical precision. Sergei was left alone, holding a useless gun pointed at a nightmare. His training dissolved into raw instinct. He fired. The round struck the vigilante squarely in the center mass of the skull emblem. The thwack of the bullet impacting the ceramic plate sounded less like a gunshot and more like a heavy mallet hitting dense marble. The vigilante didn't flinch. He didn't even rock back. The round's energy was absorbed, dispersed, and dismissed. Sergei gaped, his mind unable to process the total failure of his final, definitive threat. He squeezed the trigger again, wildly, desperately. Click. The magazine was empty. The vigilante walked the remaining steps towards Sergei with the same unhurried, inexorable pace he had used to step out of the shadows. There was no rage in his face, only cold, functional clarity. He reached out and grabbed the gun, pulling it from Sergei's slack grasp. He held the weapon up, inspecting it briefly, then tossed it into the gutter. He had no use for cheap, loud toys. Sergei tried to raise his hands in a gesture of surrender, but the vigilante was past the point of negotiation or capture. He executed a sharp, controlled strike, a quick, economic blow using the heel of his palm to the lower jaw that achieved immediate, non-lethal submission. Sergei's head snapped back, his eyes rolled, and he sank down onto the wet asphalt, a heavy sack of failure. The alley went silent again, save for the incessant drumming of the rain. The vigilante stood over the 3 neutralized threats, the smoke from the single bullet burn mark on his chest plate rising briefly in the cool air. The entire skirmish had taken less time than it took for the dashlights of the Civic to flicker. He spared a single, quick glance at the car. Sarah was still gripping the steering wheel, watching the aftermath through wide, tear-filled eyes. She hadn't screamed, hadn't moved. She had followed the single command, stay. He registered her terror but filed it away. She was safe, contained. His attention immediately reverted to the task at hand, the primary mission, Vanya. He knelt beside Sergei, the leader of the trio. The man was breathing shallowly, drool mixing with rain on his face. This man was not the target, but he was a loose thread potentially connected to the Annex's internal security detail. The Vigilante reached into Sergei's jacket pocket, retrieving a cheap, encrypted satellite phone. The screen was cracked but active. He paused, running a gloved thumb over the damp plastic. He didn't need to break the encryption now. He needed to understand the scope of the operation. Why were these three, the heavy detail, outside this alley, waiting for a simple retrieval? They were too large for simple grunt work. They were contingency. He flipped the phone open, navigating the simple menu with practiced ease, looking not for names, but for frequencies and recent contact logs. The logs showed a spike in communication within the last hour. A hurried attempt to coordinate after Dmitri, the initial captive, had been secured by Sarah and subsequently lost. The last entry was 5 minutes ago, a short coded burst to a number registered only as the Vault, the Annex. Vanya knew they were compromised. Complication. The Vigilante registered mentally. The element of surprise had just bled out into the wet asphalt alongside the lost blood and dignity of the thugs. The surgical entry he had planned, the quiet breach of the reinforced door on the 3rd floor, the swift retrieval of the files, and the subsequent incapacitation of Vanya, was now impossible. They were expecting him. He stood up, his gaze lifting past the 3 defeated men, past the slick Civic, and settling on the imposing dark silhouette of the Annex building 30 yards away. It was a fortress of concrete and darkened glass, built not just to keep people out, but to keep secrets in. This wasn't just a simple rescue mission anymore. It had evolved into a direct confrontation with the systemic root of the city's deep corruption. He was no longer playing chess. He was breaking the board. He returned to the Civic, tapping lightly on the passenger window, startling Sarah. She flinched but quickly looked up, meeting his eyes through the smeared glass. Her fear was still acute, but mixed now with a paralyzing confusion. He kept his voice low, gravelly, and entirely devoid of emotion. "Listen carefully, do not move, do not unlock the doors. You are secure here. I am leaving this area now. If anyone approaches, you use the horn. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded rapidly, clutching her hands in her lap. Yes, I understand." He scanned the immediate vicinity one last time, ensuring the 3 unconscious men were truly incapacitated and posed no immediate threat to the woman or themselves. They were neutralized liabilities, nothing more. He turned toward the Annex, the structure now dominating the narrow alley. The rain seemed to intensify as he began to move, each drop hitting the pavement with the weight of an accusation. The mission parameters had shifted. Speed was now paramount and subtlety was obsolete. He moved toward the mouth of the alley, toward the main street where the Annex's front entrance was located, moving parallel to the building's dense concrete wall. As he moved, his hand reached into his belt kit, pulling out a specialized piece of hardware, a compact, high-powered thermal viewing scope. He brought it up to his eye, peering through the lens into the blackness of the building. The building wasn't just dark, it was cold. Layers of heavy insulation and reinforced materials designed to defeat thermal signature tracking, but even the best shielding couldn't hide everything. On the 3rd floor, where the intelligence suggested Vanya kept his private office and the hard copies of the ledger, he saw small, faint blooms of heat, multiple points. Not just Vanya, but guards, alerted, moving into defensive positions. He lowered the scope, frustration a cold, bitter taste in his mouth. He had wanted the quiet execution, the clean extraction that preserved resources and minimized collateral damage. Vanya had forced his hand. He recalled the details of the intelligence package on Vanya, a former colonel in a now-defunct Eastern military, specializing in illicit finance and resource trafficking. Vanya was meticulous, paranoid, and had created a security system that relied on layers of redundancy, human and electronic. The core of his operation was the corruption of the city's ports and distribution centers, turning essential logistics into a black market operation. He wasn't just a criminal. He was an economic terrorist, draining the lifeblood of the city one transaction at a time. The city is a body, and Vanya is a tumor, the vigilante reflected, his gaze fixed on the sterile darkness of the annex. And tumors require immediate aggressive removal. He needed a point of entry that the mobilized guards wouldn't anticipate. The front door was reinforced steel, the windows were bulletproof, and the roof likely protected by motion sensors. That left the utility access, steam tunnels, ventilation shafts, or the loading dock at the rear. He decided against the tunnels, too slow, too susceptible to ambush. The rear loading dock was too open, exposed to the main street. That left the ventilation system. The building was old, repurposed from a previous life as a manufacturing plant. There had to be large intake vents near the ground level, disguised or locked down. He hugged the perimeter of the annex wall, the rough concrete scraping against his armor. The narrow gap between the building and the neighboring warehouse was choked with industrial debris and the stench of backed-up water. He moved like a shadow, ignoring the sound of the rain, focusing entirely on the tactile reality of the wall. He found it near the corner, a large grated ventilation unit, waist-high, partially obscured by an overflowing commercial bin. The metal grate was thick, secured by 4 heavy-duty bolts, clearly meant to be permanent. He knelt, inspecting the locking mechanism, standard high-grade steel, designed to resist conventional bolt cutters, not designed to resist the specific tools he carried. He reached into a utility pouch and extracted a specialized cutter, powered by a small, high-density battery pack. The tool engaged the first bolt. It wasn't silent. The friction of the industrial-grade cutter against the steel generated a high-pitched grinding whine, a sound that pierced the damp night air. He paused immediately, listening. The sound would carry, despite the rain. But they were expecting him at the front door or the roof. This noise would sound like maintenance or maybe nothing at all, absorbed by the ambient industrial drone of the port district. He resumed the work, focused and quick, cutting through the heavy bolts one by one. Whine, pop. As the 4th bolt severed, the heavy metal grate dropped away with a heavy clang onto the pavement. He quickly secured the grate, leaning it against the wall, revealing the massive dark maw of the ventilation duct. The air inside smelled sterile and cold, clearly leading deep into the structure's core. He took a final breath of the rain-washed alley air, the smell of fear and wet metal already fading. He looked back one last time at the Civic, a final check on Sarah. She was still there, a tiny island of human vulnerability in a storm of corruption and violence. He activated a secure internal comms link in his helmet, recording a short message for an unnamed contact, a failsafe. Protocol Delta established, target compromised, extraction point unsecured. Initiate cleanup protocol if contact is lost for 2 hours. Inform her that the book is closed. He killed the comms link. He didn't wait for acknowledgement. He had already climbed into the ventilation shaft, pulling himself forward and disappearing into the absolute blackness of the building's circulatory system. The metal duct scraped against his armor, a grinding sound that vanished almost instantly once he was deep inside. The confrontation outside was over. The war inside had just begun. He was moving through the dark veins of the Syndicate, headed for the heart, knowing that Vanya and his alerted crew were waiting, ready to defend the fortress of their ill-gotten gains. The surgical strike had turned into an infiltration against a high-value, entrenched target. The vigilante moved with the cold certainty of a man who knew the cost of failure was merely the delay of inevitable justice. He was coming to collect on the city's debt, and the ledger was about to be balanced in blood and silence. The vigilante exited the primary shaft in a controlled detonation of plaster and dry wall, dropping directly into the high-ceilinged atrium Vanya had repurposed as his command center. The impact was swallowed by the thick carpet, but the sudden, violent breach registered instantly on the faces of the 4 armed men clustered near the steel-reinforced elevator bank. Vanya, seated behind a mahogany desk, the size of a small boat, reacted with a look of pure predatory hatred, rising slowly, his hands already moving toward the heavy pistol holstered at his waist. The moment the vigilante's boots touched the floor, the surgical strike began. He did not issue a warning. Warnings were for lawyers, not tumors. A silenced burst from the compact rifle in his hands found the knees and shoulders of the closest two guards, delivering crippling, non-lethal incapacitation with clinical precision. They went down in synchronized, muffled heaps, their weapons skittering uselessly across the polished stone. The third guard raised his firearm too slowly. A high-density, rubber-core projectile struck the side of his head, knocking him unconscious against the wall before he could pull the trigger. The room was filled with the acrid smell of ozone and terror. Only one man remained standing between the vigilante and Vanya, a large bodyguard who clearly did not scare easily. This one raised an automatic rifle and opened fire, a deafening, rhythmic clatter that was instantly out of place in the sterile silence of the annex. The vigilante moved laterally, the rounds impacting the armor plates on his chest and shoulder with dull, heavy thuds that vibrated deep into his bones. He absorbed the impact, closing the distance, and drove the butt of his rifle into the guard's throat and jaw. The man choked, stumbling back, clutching desperately at his shattered windpipe before collapsing. The noise stopped. The vigilante advanced on Vanya, who stood frozen behind his expensive desk, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, the heavy pistol now trembling in his grip. Sarah was nowhere in sight, but the vigilante registered the small, reinforced door behind the desk. "You should have left the city, Vanya," the vigilante stated, his voice filtered and resonant through the tactical helmet, devoid of inflection or mercy. "You drew a line, and you stepped over it. That's a collection point." Vanya roared, a sound of pure desperation and wounded ego, and fired 3 times. The rounds glanced off the armored helmet, sparks momentarily illuminating the dark visor, blinding him momentarily, but doing no damage. The vigilante raised his rifle and fired once into the table directly in front of Vanya. The explosion of splintered mahogany and flying debris distracted the Syndicate boss just long enough. The vigilante crossed the remaining distance in 2 strides, knocking the gun from Vanya's hand with a precise, crushing blow to the wrist, followed by a systemic, paralyzing strike to the solar plexus. Vanya collapsed over the desk, wheezing, drowning in the sudden, agonizing reality that he was completely, utterly powerless. The vigilante ignored the dying sounds of the Syndicate man. He moved to the small, reinforced door, examining the high-security lock. He pressed a small electronic device to the surface, and a thin green light confirmed the connection. After 3 rapid, clicking sounds, the lock engaged, and the door swung open. Sarah was huddled in the corner of the small utilitarian room, shrouded in shadow. She was unharmed, but her eyes held the wide, shattered terror of someone who had seen the deepest parts of the abyss. She flinched violently at the sight of the armored figure filling the doorway, a living silhouette against the muted light of the main room. She did not scream. She merely whispered, brokenly, into the silence he had purchased for her, "Please, someone." He did not reply. He stepped inside, his posture an extension of the cold, undeniable justice that had cleaved through the annex. He simply reached out a hand, not gently, but with a firm, unyielding promise of extraction. She looked at the hand, heavy, gloved, marked by the scars of a different kind of war, and then up into the impenetrable darkness of his visor. She saw nothing human, only the manifestation of an absolute necessity, the silent, terrifying answer to a prayer she hadn't known she'd uttered. Slowly, hesitantly, she placed her small hand into his massive, armored one. The grip was immediate, solid, and relentless. He pulled her gently but firmly to her feet, turning her toward the exit. The vigilante moved them quickly, not through the main atrium where Vanya choked over the ruins of his empire, but through a separate fire exit corridor leading to the rear loading dock. The air outside was cool and wet. The rain had softened to a persistent drizzle, washing the stench of corruption down the drains. He stopped only once beside the now idling Civic. He opened the passenger door, ushering Sarah into the safety of the dark interior. She collapsed into the seat, burying her face in her hands, the sound of her shaky breathing the only audible thing above the engine. He retrieved the rifle and stood for a long moment, looking back at the annex. The building was silent now, but the police sirens were already distant wails in the surrounding districts. Soon the chaos of law enforcement and media would descend, picking apart the carcass of Vanya's syndicate. He activated the internal comms link one last time, bypassing his previous contact, sending a message directly to the network of people who would ensure the cleanup was thorough, quiet, and conclusive. Protocol Delta complete. Target secure. Extraction successful. The ledger is balanced. He closed the door of the Civic, stepped around the hood and slid into the driver's seat. He placed the heavy vehicle into gear, pulling away from the curb and disappearing into the low-hanging fog of the industrial district. There was no exhilaration, no sense of victory, only the grim, somber weight of a duty fulfilled. He was not a hero. He was a custodian of consequences, driving toward the next quiet darkness, knowing that the city never truly slept and the debts were never truly paid. Justice, he reflected, was merely the temporary suppression of chaos, a promise kept in the silence between one storm and the next. The book was closed, but the library of the night remained open, waiting for the next request.